For years, Jesse James wasn't just robbing banks. He was building something bigger, a network, a reputation, an empire that lawmen couldn't touch. Trains stopped at the sound of his name. Entire towns looked the other way. And for a moment, it felt like he had won. But then, almost overnight, it all collapsed. Not because he was caught, not because he made a mistake, but because of something much closer than anyone expected. Someone he trusted. A boy the war never released. Before the legend. Before the wanted posters. Before the name that made lawmen nervous and newspapers rich. There was just a boy on a Missouri farm. Jesse Woodson James was born September 5, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri. His father, a Baptist preacher and slave owner, left for the California gold rush when Jesse was 3 years old. He never came back. He died there, in the camps, thousands of miles from home. That absence shaped everything that followed. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Jesse was 13, too young to fight, old enough to watch his world burn. His older brother Frank rode off to join Confederate guerrillas, violent, ruthless men who burned towns and massacred civilians along the Kansas-Missouri border. The war came to the farm. Union militiamen arrived looking for Frank. They Jesse's stepfather from a tree by the neck, not to kill him, just to make a point. They whipped 15-year-old Jesse in the field. They left him alive. That was their mistake. By 1864, 16 years old, Jesse joined the guerrillas under a man called Bloody Bill Anderson. On September 27, 1864, he rode into the small Missouri town of Centralia. What happened there was later called a carnival of blood. 22 unarmed Union soldiers, men returning home on leave, were pulled from a train and executed. Their bodies were scalped, mutilated, left in the Missouri dirt. Jesse James was 16 years old. When the war finally ended in 1865, Jesse tried to surrender under a flag of truce. Union soldiers shot him in the chest anyway. He spent months recovering, nursed back to health by his cousin Zerelda, the woman he would later marry. And in those long, quiet months, something hardened inside him that would never soften again. The war didn't end for Jesse James. It just changed form. The man who made himself unstoppable. February 13th, 1866. 10 men rode into Liberty, Missouri, walked into the Clay County Savings Bank, and rode out with $60,000 in gold, currency, and bonds. It was the first daylight armed bank robbery in American history during peacetime. As they left, one of them shot dead a 17-year-old college student standing on the wrong street at the wrong moment. Nobody was spared in Jesse James's war. But here's what most people don't realize. The early robberies weren't just crime. They were a statement. The banks Jesse targeted were owned by Northern Republican businessmen, the same men who had occupied Missouri, stripped ex-Confederates of their voting rights, and threatened the land and livelihoods of Southern families still raw from the war. In Clay County and the surrounding region, many people didn't see Jesse James as a criminal. They saw him as one of their own. Fighting back, Jesse united with his brother Frank, with Cole Younger and his brothers, with former Confederate soldiers who had come home to find their futures closed off. Together they became the James Younger Gang, robbing banks across 7 states, stagecoaches, even a county fair in Kansas City, in broad daylight, while crowds watched in stunned silence. And that's when things escalated. On July 21, 1873, near Adair, Iowa, Jesse's men pried the spikes out of a railroad track. A train derailed. They robbed it at gunpoint. The world's first robbery of a moving train. The newspapers couldn't print it fast enough. And here's what separated Jesse James from every outlaw who came before him. He understood that the crime alone was never enough. You needed the story. He cultivated a journalist named John Newman Edwards, ex-Confederate officer turned newspaper editor, who published Jesse's personal letters and framed every robbery as righteous Southern rebellion. Jesse wrote to the press proclaiming innocence on specific charges while proudly wearing the outlaw's identity in general. "We are not thieves," he wrote. "We are bold robbers. I am proud of the name, for Alexander the Great was a bold robber, and Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte." The public consumed every word. The Pinkerton Detective Agency came after him, failed repeatedly. In 1875, Pinkerton agents threw an incendiary device through the window of Jesse's family home. It exploded in the kitchen, killed his 8-year-old half-brother, blew off his mother's right hand. Public sympathy swung completely to Jesse. His neighbors protected him. His name spread from Missouri to the East Coast. Dime novelists turned him into a frontier Robin Hood, a myth Jesse knew was false but never corrected, because fiction was far more useful than the truth. At this point, Jesse James wasn't running from the law. The law was struggling to keep up with him. When the walls started closing in, empires built on violence and secrecy have one fatal weakness. They depend entirely on trust. And trust, in a world where every man alive knows where the bodies are buried, is the most fragile thing in existence. The first catastrophic crack came September 7, 1876, Northfield, Minnesota. The James Younger gang rode into a quiet farming town to rob the First National Bank. What they didn't know was that the citizens of Northfield were armed, watching, and ready. The townspeople opened fire in the streets. 2 gang members were killed on the spot. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, were shot multiple times and eventually captured. Cole Younger alone absorbed 11 bullets. Only Jesse and Frank escaped. The gang that had operated across half a dozen states with near-perfect efficiency for a decade was destroyed in 8 minutes on a Minnesota street. Jesse and Frank vanished to Tennessee. New names, quiet lives. Jesse became Thomas Howard. For nearly 3 years, he disappeared from every criminal record in existence. But here's what most people don't realize about those years of silence. Jesse James couldn't stop. Not because he needed the money, because he needed to be Jesse James. The identity had consumed the man so completely that without the robberies, without the headlines, without the legend, he was nothing. Just a Missouri farmer with a violent past and no future worth living. In 1879, he returned. New gang. But this is where everything started to change, and not in a good way. These men weren't former Confederate soldiers bound together by shared loss and wartime loyalty. They were drifters, strangers, men in it purely for profit. Men who, when the pressure came, would calculate whether loyalty to Jesse James was worth more than their own survival. It wasn't. By 1881, the gang was quietly disintegrating. Members drifted away. Some surrendered to authorities. Some simply vanished. Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden issued a public proclamation, $10,000 for the capture of Frank or Jesse James. In today's money, nearly $300,000. Every man still standing near Jesse James was doing that math. And this is where the empire quietly started to break. Not from the outside, from within. The man Jesse should never have trusted. His name was Robert Ford, 20 years old, Ray County, Missouri. He had grown up consuming the Jesse James legend, the bank robberies, the train derailments, the letters to the press, and he idolized every word of it. He wanted to belong to something bigger than himself. He wanted to be close to the fire. Jesse saw it immediately. The way Ford watched him across the table, The way he absorbed every word, every gesture, every detail. Ford was exactly the kind of follower that powerful men both need and quietly despise. Too eager, too obvious, too hungry for reflected glory to ever be fully trusted. Jesse said it plainly to people who knew him. "Bob Ford I don't trust. I think he is a sneak." He said this, and then he let Ford into his house anyway. Because by early 1882, Jesse James had almost no one left. In January of that year, a fight broke out between two gang members at the home of Ford's own sister. Wood Height, Jesse's cousin, was shot in the head. The man who pulled the trigger was Robert Ford. Ford had just killed Jesse's family. When authorities arrested him for it, he offered something in exchange. He told the sheriff he could deliver Jesse James. He then met in secret with Governor Crittenden himself. The arrangement was direct. Jesse James, receive a full pardon, collect a share of the $10,000 reward. Ford agreed, then walked back through Jesse's front door, back to the breakfast table, back to the conversations about upcoming robberies, back to the role of trusted gang member, with a pistol on his hip and a governor's promise in his pocket. April 3rd, 1882, St. Joseph, Missouri, a Tuesday morning. Jesse was living under the name Thomas Howard, passing himself off to the neighbors as a cattle buyer. His wife Z was in the kitchen. His two young children were in the house. The Ford brothers, Robert and his older brother Charlie, were staying with them, planning a bank job in Platte City. Over breakfast, Jesse read the morning newspaper. And what he read made him go quiet. Dick Liddell, another gang member, had confessed to authorities. His confession included details about Wood Height's murder, details the Ford brothers should have brought directly to Jesse, details they had buried in silence. Jesse knew. He could feel exactly what was happening in that room. And here is the moment that no historian has ever fully explained. Jesse James, the man who survived 16 years as the most wanted outlaw in America, who had escaped Pinkerton raids, state posses, and the Northfield massacre, who had built and protected a criminal empire with something close to tactical genius. That man set his revolvers down on the sofa. He walked to the far wall, noticed a dusty picture hanging above the mantel, a needlepoint that read, "In God We Trust." He stepped up onto a chair to straighten it. His back was to the room. He was unarmed. Jesse James wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He wasn't even armed. Robert Ford drew his .45 caliber Colt revolver, the same gun Jesse had once given him as a gift, and fired a single shot into the back of Jesse's head. Jesse James was dead before he hit the floor. He was 34 years old. Minutes later, Robert Ford was running down the street screaming, "I killed him. I shot Jesse James." The coward the world never forgave. The news hit the country like a shockwave. By the following morning, every major newspaper in America had the story, and the public reaction was not remotely what Robert Ford had anticipated. He had killed the most wanted outlaw in the country. He had secured the governor's pardon. He thought the world would celebrate him. Instead, Missouri turned on him overnight. The entire country turned on him, because the method of the killing, from behind, unarmed, in his own home, by a man he had fed and housed, felt like a violation of something deeper than law. Jesse's family put it into stone. His tombstone read, "Jesse W. James, murdered by a traitor and a coward whose name is not worthy to appear here." Ford attempted to cash in on the killing by taking the story on the road, a traveling stage show where he reenacted the murder night after night. He was met with catcalls, jeers, and open contempt at every stop. The man who hoped to build a career on the killing found instead that he had made himself into a permanent symbol of betrayal and cowardice. He spent the rest of his short life running from that shadow. 10 years after killing Jesse James, Robert Ford was himself shot dead from behind in a tent saloon in Creede, Colorado. He was 30 years old. His grave marker reads only, "The man who shot Jesse James, not hero, not lawman, just that. A life defined entirely by someone else's death." The man who built an empire wasn't taken down by the law. He was taken down from behind. The question nobody can answer. One question has never been answered. Did Jesse James see it coming? He said he didn't trust Robert Ford. He knew the gang was collapsing around him. He read the newspaper that Tuesday morning and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. And then, in a move that defies everything we know about the man, he set his weapons down and turned his back on two men he had every reason to fear. Was it carelessness? Exhaustion? A death wish buried beneath the legend? Did Jesse James, the man who had engineered his own myth with more precision than any outlaw before or since, somehow understand that every story needs an ending, and this was his? We will never know. What we do know is this: Jesse James was never a Robin Hood. There is no evidence he ever shared a single dollar of his stolen money with anyone outside his gang. He was not a simple criminal. His crimes carried the full weight of a lost war, a broken world, and a need for recognition so consuming that even when walking away might have saved his life, he couldn't do it. He built the legend himself, wrote the letters, cultivated the press, shaped the myth in real time while the robberies continued. And that same legend, the one that made men want to stand close to him, to be part of something larger than themselves, is precisely what put Robert Ford in his house on that quiet Tuesday morning in April. In the end, Jesse James didn't fall because he wasn't powerful. He fell because power means nothing when the person standing behind you pulls the trigger.